Welcome to the Intentional Homeschooling Podcast. I'm your host, Chantel, and here we like to talk about books and homeschooling, mostly using good books. So today I thought I would expand on this idea of using good books in our homeschool and reading good books, and talk about the idea of using literature as the spine for our homeschool. Now, just to give you a little bit of a background on our homeschool method, we're very eclectic. I pull from Charlotte Mason. I love a lot from Charlotte Mason. A lot of people say that we are more Charlotte Mason than we think, and I kind of agree with that, other than the fact that a lot of the Charlotte Mason method has to do with a lot more structure and routines than we like. So we pull stuff from there. We're not strictly Charlotte Mason. We love some good unit studies. There's seasons where we are like unschooling and just enjoying following our interests and learning that way. So our homeschool kind of just flows a little bit. We do what works best for us in that season. I always try to have a relaxed approach, no matter which season we're in though, because people are always changing, our interests are always changing, and I'm just always willing to change things up if they're not working. Okay, so why would we use literature in our homeschool? Well, I mean, we all know why we would use it in our homeschool, but maybe why use it as a spine? And I think there are quite a few good reasons for this. As someone that has always been a reader, for me, it's just because I love to read. And even as an adult, I love to read good books and read books before my kids so I can recommend them. But not everybody feels that way. Not everybody who has kids who are readers. And if you want to develop kids who are readers, I recommend you go and check out, I think podcast episode number 2 is all about raising a reader and ways to go about that if they're struggling or if they're just learning to read. I have some ideas there for that. But I think one of the biggest reasons we could use literature as our spine for our homeschool is because we all learn better through story. Now, when I'm thinking about using literature for spine, we'll get into like how to learn different subjects through this, but obviously history is generally going to be a big thing you're going to be learning if you're reading a historical fiction book. And I am brought back to my days of history in high school where we just read from a textbook. Sometimes we would take turns reading, sometimes we would be reading it silently to ourselves, sometimes my teacher would be pacing and reading. So we did different ways of reading, but it was always from a textbook. And I can honestly tell you, I remember zero from the history that I learned in high school. I couldn't learn that way. Now, had we read stories, so like when we were learning about, I don't know, different topics, we probably learned about that I don't remember, like the French Revolution. Had I read a novel, a story about it, then I probably would have been more interested in learning like the actual history. And that is just one of the examples of how using a literature for the spine of your homeschool is so beneficial. Stories, we feel like we can place ourselves in stories. So when we're reading a story about, let's just keep talking about the French Revolution here, we can kind of insert ourselves in there and think about how we would have responded in that situation, how we would have done during that time period. And it's easier to remember facts when you've learned them through story than just being told these dry facts, these dates, and then this happened, and this date, and this happened, and now you have to memorize it, and then you have to spit it back out. Honestly, you're better off not knowing the date and just remembering the general time and what actually happened, as opposed to being able to like recite. Like, how often does somebody ask you like, when was the Great Cholera Epidemic of London? Not very often. And maybe you can spout the answer, but it would probably be more interesting to tell people the background of how like Dr. Snow figured out that it was the water that was causing the illness and not all these other ideas that people had. That's more interesting than being able to spout the year that it occurred. When we can see ourselves in stories, we can insert ourselves into them. We can learn compassion for different situations, different people groups, different times in history. And while we're doing all that we are raising readers. So that just gives you a little bit of information on why you could use should, I don't know if you should, but you definitely could use literature as a spine. There are many other reasons, but you guys aren't here just to listen to me tell you all the reasons you should read good books in your homeschool, so we'll move along for now. There was actually a study done it spanned over 2 decades, and they were studying the benefits of having a home library, and it may surprise some, it may not surprise some, how many benefits there are to having a home library. Things like increasing a child's academic success, increasing their vocabulary, helping them with future job attainment. There are all these benefits to having a home library, and if you live somewhere where that's not possible and going to the library is your routine, I think also, having your shelves with library books is totally fine too. But that is kind of what we're doing here when we are using literature as a spine in our homeschool. I like to collect books. I like having a home library. I like having access to books for myself, for my kids. I fully believe in the results of this 2-decade-long study. So maybe I've convinced you, maybe you were already convinced and you're like, okay, let's get on to this already. How do you use literature as a spine? Now, I'm going to give you some ideas here, but I am also in the process of creating a list of good books based on time periods, and then after that I'm also going to do one based off of ages that I am going to be putting together. I'm going to be having a nice big book list that you can use for using as a spine in your homeschool, using literature as a spine, and I'm going to be putting those up, the book lists up, but they're going to go up in my membership first. So if you have listened to the last few podcast episodes or followed me online, you'll know that I have a membership that is just $30 for an entire year, and each month you're getting exclusive videos from me, exclusive homeschool resources and downloads, and access to a community forum and a seasonal book club and an optional pen pal sign up. There's lots of things over in the membership. They get all the things that I create now for free and first. So if you're interested in this, that's definitely the place to be. I'm working on, like I said, a book list, but for them I'm also going to be creating a complete detailed guide on how to use literature as a spine with lots of different ideas, and along with the book list there will be ages attached to it. And then for those in my membership, I'm going to also be having a few different notes on different books, like maybe things to be aware of, or just things you might want to know going in, positive or maybe negative depending on your homeschool, or some of your philosophies. So members get everything first for free, included with their $30 membership. So the way you start using literature as a spine is starting with good books. So if you need ideas for books, I'm going to be having you covered very soon. And then the point is just to read them. So there are a number of different ways you can do this. My preferred way, what we are heading into right now in our homeschool, is picking a time period and then getting the kids to each read books based on that time period, the same time period, but different books because my kids are different ages. So with using literature as a spine, you can be teaching your homeschool with multiple ages, but you can be teaching them kind of together. So my kids are reading different books set in the same time period, and then we're coming together and we're talking about things, and even the younger have things to teach the older ones because they're reading different books. So they might be reading about the same time period, but different things will come up in different books. So obviously using literature as a spine, that shows a very like language arts focus, emphasis, and one other way that we work on things like grammar and spelling and printing, handwriting in our homeschool is by doing a notebooking page. So right now I require that my kids do one notebooking page a week based on the book that they are reading for me for like school. And I'm also getting them to draw a picture along with it. So we've got language arts, we've got art there as well. And a lot of people ask me about when I say we don't like use an actual curriculum, one of the questions I often get is like, how do you teach your kids diagramming sentences? And I don't. I don't know when I've ever needed to know how to diagram a sentence in my entire life. So I don't teach my kids that. If they ever want to know, we'll Google it and figure it out and I'll teach them. But I feel like I may as well just teach them the things that are beneficial and teach them how to learn. And if they want to know other things, they can learn those on their own or after they're out of my home. So while we're doing our notebooking page, they are learning spelling. I do want things spelled properly. They're learning like grammar, like capitals and periods and all those kinds of things. But I don't see a need in teaching them things that they're not going to use in the future, or I currently don't see as necessary. But if they ever ask me to teach them how to diagram a sentence, I will figure it out and let them know. But I am in my 30s, graduated university with honors, and have never needed to know how. So I find it interesting that's something people get stuck on. Okay, so I've touched a little bit on art and language arts. And I mentioned before about history. If you are reading a historical fiction book, chances are you're going to be coming across a lot of history. We like to Google things, search on YouTube. We will often rabbit trail. If we are reading a book that is set in a certain time in history, all of a sudden we're learning about something else that happened during that time or something that was mentioned in the book. And often I will proof the videos beforehand. Sometimes I know some channels I can trust, and so I won't proof that specific video. But we're often learning lots of history, especially as we're reading historical fiction. And then geography. Once again, if it's historical fiction, it took place somewhere, so we'll look up that country on the map. We have a few different maps and globes in our house. My globes that I do own are both dated, so they have different countries that no longer exist on there, but that is a conversation where we can talk about how borders change and countries change, and sometimes when you're reading a historical fiction book, that country no longer exists, and we can talk about it that way. And then we'll often talk about the different countries that are around that country and how that affected what was going on during that time. And right now we are reading a historical fiction book that has to do with, well, they've mentioned that the recent invention of the printing press, and so that is history, but we can also learn the science behind the printing press. Or like I mentioned before about the cholera epidemic, we can learn about that whole epidemic and the science behind that. So even though you are using literature as a spine, it doesn't mean you're just learning language arts. You can rabbit trail and follow and learn about all the different subjects based on a book, depending on the book. Some of them are easier than others. Historical fiction is obviously easier than maybe like a fantasy book, but even that can be, you can use science. Maybe you can figure out how to replicate something that they do magically. Maybe, you do a baking soda and vinegar kind of experiment to have the same effect. Using any kind of book can teach you subjects beyond just language arts. And then there are books like classics, which in the time were not a historical fiction book, but now, 100 or 150 years later, it is in many ways a historical fiction book because we're learning about the time period that it was set in, and you can analyze, look up different customs and different things based on that time period. So many books have so much to teach us. I often get asked how I find out about books, and honestly, I look things up a lot. I watch a bunch of book videos. Like I've said before, I also have a BookTube channel, which is just a channel on YouTube where I talk solely about books, and I look at book lists, and I scour Goodreads, and I search things a lot. And it is my goal to be able to read a lot of these books for you and put in front of people books that I highly recommend, because I know not everybody is as interested in reading as I am. Not everybody wants to proof all the books their kids read. Even I don't at this point. I feel like I've gotten them to a point where they know what a good book is, and now I can trust their opinion a little bit. But I do enjoy reading books, so that is kind of the point behind my website. I have a bunch of book lists, And then, like I said, there is this big book list that I'm working on that is broken down into different time periods. I'm giving book suggestions, and then I'm also saying the grade that I recommend those books for, and those will be going up for everybody, but first to the members of my membership site. And then in addition, my members are going to be getting a little bit of information about each book that I think they might want to know, and then a whole guide on like specifically how to use literature in their homeschool. I'm going to use some examples, and I think it's going to be a really good resource. So I highly recommend signing up for my membership if you want the first to be in the loop and to get it for just $30 plus a bunch of other stuff. That is all for this week's episode. Thanks so much for being here, and I will be back again next week.